Good evening, everybody. I'm Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University. And welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. We're glad you're here. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU's School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training, and we facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics and leadership. And tonight we want to discuss a key question that really is at the heart of so many conversations about women in politics. It's also the subtitle of a new book, Electable: Why America Hasn't Put a Woman in the White House, yet, by Ali Vitali, who covers Congress for NBC News. Before her post on the Hill, however, she covered both the 2016 presidential election, which of course saw a woman as the Democratic nominee in Hillary Clinton, and the 2020 presidential election, which saw a record-breaking 6 women run for the White House and 1 woman, of course, elected as vice president. So we're thrilled Ali is here with us tonight to talk about her front row seat on the campaign trail and help us reflect on the progress that's been made and the progress yet to be made. But before we start, I want to let everybody know that we're going to save plenty of time for your questions. So please feel free to submit those into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those toward the end of our time with Ali. So with that, Ali, welcome.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here with you. An amazing introduction. Thank you, Betsy.
Well, we appreciate it so much, and congratulations on the book. It's really, I mean, a great chronicle of all of the discussions that I feel like we all had so many times, especially in 2020 when we had this incredible field of 6 women, unprecedented, running for president, and you were there covering it all. And so I just really appreciate, the putting it all in one place is just such a handy thing to have because, like I said, it was discussions that we just had constantly. So I guess maybe I'll start with that with you, just to give us, a little bit of overview of your time on the campaign trail, and, the impact that these 6 women may still have on the future of finally maybe electing a woman as president.
Well, look, 2020 didn't look historic in the way that we thought it would look historic, but there was still history made from it. The fact that you have Vice President Kamala Harris now, she is someone who is barrier breaking, even if she isn't breaking that final barrier of being president of the United States. But look, for me, 2020 really presented an opportunity here as someone who's always been so fascinated by the intersection of gender and politics to finally have a field of more than just one woman, showcasing that there are a whole bunch of different ways to run, in this case, as a female Democrat, and ultimately to have it shake out in this kind of an election cycle where you had 2016, where the majority of the country said, we're ready for a woman president. That's not the way we elect our presidents, but it's still a really important metric when you consider, is the country ready? But then to have 2020 shake out the way that it did, there were lessons to be learned, things that I hope to apply in my own reporting and in others' reporting going forward. But for me, this book was an exercise in storytelling and reminding people of a lot of the experiences that we all lived through in 2019 and 2020, and before that in 2016, but doing them with a heavily gender lens on top of them, which is not something we often get to do in just the daily coverage and reporting.
Right. And I mean, even the title of your book, Electable, I feel like that was a topic so much that was kind of cocktail party conversations and people were having with their families, is a woman electable? But even asking that question, as you point out in the book, sort of undermines the electability of a woman. So are we kind of stuck in that circle in many ways?
Yeah. I often thought about this as a feedback loop too. And to me, there was no other title that you could use to talk about the women in the 2020 election other than electable, because it was the metric that it all came down to. Fairly, I would argue, because most voters want to know that they're picking a winner, but then unfairly, because as they were considering that in 2020, there's so much that's baked into that. But truly, electability is unknowable until people actually go to the polls and vote, and you have someone who wins and someone who loses. And so really, electability is a benefit of the doubt metric. And even when you had the women at every turn asked in various number of ways, can a woman win? Can you win? Even when they tried to answer those questions, it seems that all of their explanations fell short, in part because these candidates, these women candidates, were faced with something that you talk about a lot, an imagination barrier, where they are asking people not just imagine them in the Oval, but imagine someone who has never looked like a president being in the Oval. And then there was the Trump of it all, which was an extra complicating factor in 2020, and one that all of the women who ran, who I talked to for this book, from Secretary Hillary Clinton to Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Amy Klobuchar, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Carly Fiorina, who ran in 2016, all of them chalk up the fact that it's complicated to run when you're a woman already, but it's extra complicated when Trump is in the mix. And that was definitely the case in 2020.
Exactly. Take us through the field a little bit. You mentioned Kirsten Gillibrand, and I wanted to start with her because right out of the gate in 2020, her campaign seemed very, very focused on gender issues.
Yeah.
Do you think that, in retrospect, that for whatever reason that didn't click? Was it a candidate thing? And how does she reflect on her candidacy now? Because she sort of came out of that box and like ready to go, and then just flamed out pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, look, you and I both know I come at this first as a political reporter, right? So there are a lot of political reasons, and I lay these out in the book too, for why the women of 2020 didn't ultimately end up being the nominee. But at the same time, the untangible part of the pie chart, where you chalk up the explanations for why these people aren't the nominee of the Democratic Party or the president right now, that intangible number is, in my estimation, gender. And just because we can't quantify it doesn't mean we shouldn't speak about it. And so in the case of Kirsten Gillibrand, she's someone who ran family forward, stereotypically female issues, used to talk on the campaign trail about a family bill of rights and being able to fight for Americans' families in the same way that she fights for her own. And there's an interesting feedback loop that comes when you are a non-white, non-male candidate, where if you run on the issues that are authentic to the group that you embody and represent, there's an authenticity there and an expectation that you'll be the person to speak to those issues. But then there's also the part where it's easier for you to get stuck as just being seen as a single issue candidate. And if you want to be president, you got to be the person who governs everybody and everything. And it's a reminder that there is an objectivity given to straight white male candidates that not everyone else who runs gets to enjoy so easily. That's not to say that they can't. You compare someone like Gillibrand, who ran on family issues, with someone like Elizabeth Warren, who was also campaigning on care economy issues, things like universal pre-K, universal childcare. And certainly Warren wasn't only seen as a candidate about women's issues. She had deep roots in explaining the economy and healthcare.
Right.
So there are ways to break out of it, but there has to be an awareness. And look, for Gillibrand, she came up with one of the most interesting conclusions of the book when I talked to her, where she said her estimation on 2020 was she didn't think that any woman could have won in that election cycle, which is a striking conclusion to draw. But she said that because in her estimation, it was that electing a woman still carried an air of risk. And this electorate on the Democratic side in 2020 was just so risk averse because the only thing they wanted was someone who could beat Trump.
Right. And that definitely loomed over things. When I think about kind of progress that's been made, and you write about this a bit in your book as well, when we talk about kind of the qualification question, and, think back to even 2008, when Hillary Clinton first ran for the Democratic nomination, of course, famously against Barack Obama. But she, right out of the gate, had to answer that kind of qualification question. And she structured a lot of her campaign about proving that she was qualified. And fast forward from there, I think, no one could argue that so many of the women that ran in 2020, I mean, they were very qualified. That did not seem to be as much of a factor maybe as it had been in the past.
Yeah. And in fact, I would also argue we spend a lot of time, I think rightfully so, talking about the 4 women senators who ran in Gillibrand, Klobuchar, Harris, and Warren. They were traditionally viable, but someone like Tulsi Gabbard, an elected House member, had cleared the literal electability threshold in that she had been elected to federal office. And frankly, I choose to see Gabbard and Marianne Williamson who was also celebrated as an expert in her field, definitely a non-traditional field to translate into a presidential run. But nevertheless, there was an expertise there. And I actually choose to see them as signs of progress, because how many, frankly, mediocre or outside the box or generic House members who were men have we seen run for this office and fall short and just join the field of also rans and try to use it to parlay it into something bigger and better and whatever comes next. So I actually see them as points of progress in this, despite the fact that some people in talking to me for this book almost called them the problematic women of 2020. And in fact, I think that they just represent other paradigms of how to do this. And by the thresholds that we deem viable, they always were going to have a harder path because they weren't senators with deep portfolios, big war chests, and attracting the best talent to run their campaigns.
Right. Well, and you mentioned too, the fact that these women were elected to legislative office, which is very different than we think about executive office, governors, even mayors, and obviously, of course, president. And there's been research on this topic, but what did you find in the book and the conversations you had with folks about the differences in voters' minds when electing a woman to a legislative kind of position versus an executive position?
Well, look, the mindset is completely different. And I feel like you guys have done great research on this. The Barbara Lee Family Foundation folks did a ton of great research on this. It's different going for federal offices that are part of a body, so Congress, right? Or state legislatures, other things that are large groups of people who were elected here, as opposed to being the boss, the executive, the mayor, the governor, and of course the president. And it's why I think that we've seen women be able to grow their ranks in Congress, not as quickly as I think many of us would like them to, but it's happening now at a quicker clip. Each Congress, you get to watch this line charting how many women make up the body, and it's consistently going up. And that's a fantastic trend, because both parties are realizing that they need to invest in diverse candidates, and that women are very competitive in a lot of the seats that both parties want to stay competitive in. Now, there's a caveat to that, which is that there is concern that I've heard from Republican and Democratic operatives alike that you could end up with a situation where there are certain House seats that are swingy and well suited to women, and you end up just having a Republican woman replace a Democratic woman, and then a Democratic one.
That doesn't move the needle.
And that doesn't help anybody in growing the ranks overall. But it is a sign of progress that that's even a conversation that we're having, I suppose. But certainly, when it comes to executive offices, the qualifications that we automatically think of for these roles tend to be a little bit more male in the way that we think of someone who can be commanding, someone who can be agentic, someone who is an individual leader, as opposed to someone who is better representing the collective, the community, the whole. And so it's a reframing moment for us too, to sort of tackle the way that the patriarchy has built these structures around men, for men, and to continue to be held by men. And it's on these women candidates to then have to navigate the barriers of getting there. But frankly, again, I am confident that we will.
Right. And then you also, have then the likability question comes in as well. If you're, if you are seen as too tough, you might not be likable enough. And you end up with the push and pull in that sense as well in executive office.
Right. Well, and it's also, the idea of likability, I think that for some of us in the media, before you dig into this, it's sort of like, it's a metric, of course, that we've now seen as gendered. But it's also a metric that people might think, oh, it's just nice to be liked. In fact, that's not true. Women need to be liked in order to earn people's votes, whereas people are much more forgiving to vote for a man who they don't like. And I heard this time and again when I was out covering Trump. I really don't like the way he talks. I really don't like that he did this or that, but I'm still going to vote for him. It's a lot harder to find the women or the voters who are saying that about the women candidates. And instead, those conversations tend to devolve into, well, there's just something about her that I don't like.
Or I don't like the way she talks, or she's too shrill, or
she knows too much. She doesn't know enough.
Yeah.
She's qualified. She's too qualified.
And you write in the book too, and there's a couple different avenues on this very story about Kamala Harris in that first debate. Going after Joe Biden on the issue of busing, right? And the fact that, while it may have helped her in a very short term, people saw that as political opportunism, which of course in politics, it's omnipresent everywhere, right?
Name of the game.
Right. But when you're a woman, and again, you get hit with being too political, too opportunistic, and that doesn't sit well with voters in many ways.
Those are words that carry such a deeper meaning, and they shouldn't have an impact on the way that we view people and their leadership qualifications. But for women in particular, we do, and the electorate did. And at each of the moments that these women had arguably strong debate performances, in that they were showing what they were about, they were also going after other candidates. You know, the name of that game is, none of these moments are actually as spontaneous as they appear on TV. Many of them are actually workshopped. And yet at each turn, Kamala Harris during the first debate over busing with Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren when she was on the stage in Las Vegas taking down Michael Bloomberg, at various points, even when the women were winning, it seemed like they were somehow also losing. And so there is a calculation that has to be made. The juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak, that the point is worth making, that you could alienate a few voters, but then also finding a way to do it that doesn't make you seem unlikable, but also makes you seem commanding. I do also think that with Kamala Harris, one of the things that plagued her presidential campaign was the fact that it always seemed to kind of fall apart in the details, politically speaking. And that was true with the busing moment, where Biden's policy and Harris's policy on, frankly, an issue that was pretty arcane to the electorate in 2020, their positions actually ended up being somewhat the same. And so Harris had this feedback pattern on the campaign where it always seemed like the policy story or the explanation or the details were changing. And politically, that's a reason why that moment was bad for her. But it doesn't explain the voters that I would meet who said that they felt really hurt or wounded or upset or angry at her because she would go at someone this way, when really that's the name of the game. You got to be debating. You've got to be contrasting. In a field of 19 or 20 people, you've got to differentiate yourself somehow. But the operatives who I spoke to in real time, I'm sure you were talking to them too, and then after, almost all of them said that the conclusion that they drew from watching these women on the debate stages was just, we don't like it when women self-advocate, and we don't like it when women aggressively go after their goals.
How do you know, when you talk to people from that campaign, do you know if they thought about that ahead of time? Did they sort of map out the different consequences of this? I mean, clearly it was a planned sort of attack, right? Do you think that there was, a debate within the debate team about whether to do that or not?
Look, I think at this point, the thing that they still clearly have sticking with them, even, as we were unpacking this over a year after it happened, was this idea of the t-shirts, that little girl was me t-shirts. And it's not unheard of for campaigns to take viral moments and just try to fundraise as much as they possibly can off of them. That is the whole point of being on a debate stage, is just like get as much
the Marco Rubio water bottle. Yeah.
My God, yes. Exactly. This was a much cooler version of the water bottle, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and the t-shirts became emblematic of this idea that, they planned it. They were just profiting off of Biden being in a bad political spot that Kamala Harris put him in. And in fact, yes, Senator Harris at that point did put him in a bad political spot, because that's what you try to do with your opponents. He was the front runner at that time. No one had been able to lay a glove on him because it was the first debate. Of course you do this. What the campaign still says is that the t-shirts themselves were not some pre-planned, preordained part of their strategy, but instead something that popped up organically through their digital team. But again, the t-shirts sort of became emblematic of this larger idea that they planned it. And it's like, yeah, they did, but why is that so offensive?
Right. And it's something that men do all the time in debates.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, even just look back at 2015 and 2016, the way that Donald Trump would go after, and frankly, that his opponents would go after him. Things got really, there was a lot of name calling. That was sort of the vibe of that primary. But at the same time, no one was saying, oh, wow, these men are just, it's a reflection on their leadership ability. It didn't hit as personally at that point.
Yeah. So while we're talking about Kamala and clothing, I want to go to the story that you have about was it South Carolina, right? That you all were with her, and you all will tell the story about going to this clothing store and sort of what followed. And it was a great example of kind of sexism at work in a campaign.
Sexism at work in a campaign, and it happened so early on. So I remember coming down, we were in Columbia, South Carolina, on a street called Lady Street, a street of predominantly women of color owned businesses, which is just tailor-made for a candidate like Kamala Harris. And this is the bread and butter of being a presidential candidate, right? You go out, you don't just do rallies in stadiums. In fact, most of the rallies you start out doing are at coffee shops and diners and wherever people live their lives organically. It's meeting voters where they are. So this was a day that felt very on brand for Kamala Harris. We go into this store. It is a thrift store. The owner has an amazing story of being homeless as a young woman, being able to be lifted up by her community out of homelessness into college. Now she runs a business. Not only that, she also runs a business to give back to homeless youth. It is a really amazing story of people innovating within their own communities and women innovating within their own communities. But in the process of participating in shopping, Kamala Harris picked up a sparkly jacket that I went to Tulane, New Orleans. Mardi Gras is, this is the costume. I mean, you find a good sparkly jacket, you stick with that sparkly jacket. Exactly. And so for me, for other reporters in the press corps, this was an easy moment of levity. And I think the whole group, predominantly women, I would add, but seasoned veteran campaign reporters, all of us on our second or third presidential campaign, sort of egged her on to try it on. She did, she laughed, the sleeves were too big, the whole thing was just like a mess. She bought it, of course, because the jacket could not be passed up. But nevertheless, we left the store after, tweeting about this, but also the conversation that she had had with the store owner. And I found that some white conservative men online sort of clutched their ties at the very idea that this could be a day on the campaign trail with female reporters covering a female presidential candidate. There were a lot of questions that he raised that others on the right wing and then in more establishment legacy media organizations echoed. This idea that it was unserious, that we were somehow in the tank for the candidate, that the candidate wasn't doing the job of being a serious presidential candidate, despite the fact that not only had male contenders shopped before, Mitt Romney did this, Barack Obama did this, but also men had been allowed to do any number of things during their so-called retail politics stops. John Hickenlooper was a guy who owned breweries in his early entrepreneurship. We did a lot at breweries with John Hickenlooper. Lindsey Graham went skeet shooting when he ran in 2015. Reporters went along for that and wrote about it in the first person in the Times, in the Post. No one criticized that. But when it was a woman doing a stereotypically female task, just being a presidential candidate, it was a reminder to me that there's still an uncomfortability with women in the media and the narratives that we would put forward. But there's certainly an uncomfortability with women candidates just simply doing the job of running for president. And there are invisible traps that they can fall into simply just by being a candidate that men don't have to worry about. And having that reminder at that early point in the campaign really set the tone for me that yes, there was progress because there were 6 women running and it was the most diverse field ever, but also there were pitfalls that still very much existed.
Well, when we think about the media coverage, talk a little bit about, what I would consider now is, people being more willing to, like, if they see something, say something, that people are more apt to call not only, other politicians out, but media out when there is, coverage that, has, sexist kind of language around something. Talk about how maybe that has changed over the past, 10 years or so, and how, you and the media and your colleagues kind of deal with some of those issues.
And look, it's a good thing that there is more empowerment to call those things out. I think the more women that you have at every echelon of a newsroom, the better your coverage is going to look. but it's not perfect. And it doesn't mean that it means that there's no narrative that's going to be misogynistic that crops up. I would give two examples that show a sign of progress and then a sign that we are definitely not past genderism in campaigning. The first would be that when I was talking to one Democratic operative, they said to me that after Kamala Harris got the nomination as vice president, she was getting a lot of calls from male reporters saying, am I allowed to say this about Kamala Harris? Am I allowed to say this about Kamala Harris? And she would laugh because the calls would be the most basic thing in the world. And the thing that she would say is, well, if you would say it about Joe Biden, or if you would say it about Donald Trump, then you can consider saying it about Kamala Harris. And a lot of those things never got written. But I think it's a sign of progress that especially men writing about women would think to ask and disrupt their own biases and narratives in real time. I think that's awesome. But then you turn to something like the Veep stakes, which was crafted in part, the Democratic Party, knowing they were going to have a female nominee, came together, a lot of operatives, a lot of women's groups formed We Have Her Back. They got as much buy-in as they could to try to disrupt sexist narratives before they started. They would go on cable, and when they were asked to compare Karen Bass or Kamala Harris, they instead would sort of get rid of the premise of that and just say, well, Karen Bass would be great because this, Kamala Harris would be great because this. We're not pitting them against each other. That's one thing that was a positive sign. But then still, the Veep stakes itself devolved into a conversation about people who were self-advocating and being seen as too ambitious, despite the fact that Mike Pence or Joe Biden or Al Gore, none of these men just fell into the vice presidency. They had the ambition to at least network for it behind the scenes. But the weird thing about 2020 was everything was happening either on Zoom privately or on Zoom on television. And the only way that you had to talk about if you wanted to be vice president was to say that you wanted to be vice president. And it was only women doing it.
Yes. And ambition in politics goes hand in hand. You inherently don't run for office if you don't have ambition, right? But that Veep stakes is interesting too, because I think in many ways, you know, by Biden coming out and saying that he was going to nominate a woman, you ended up having sort of this, you know, contest play out in the media where these women were, you know, essentially dissected and criticized every which way. And by the way, there were other women doing it, other potential candidates doing it to other women, opposition research-wise, I know. But, you know, versus Biden just picking a woman for vice president. And so just, you know, the upside of, yes, we have a female vice president, but wouldn't it be great if he just actually picked a woman and we didn't have to have this kind of stakes going through, you know, the negativity on, you know, each of these potential women.
I mean, look, the oppo is always going to be there, right? Because politics is still politics at the end of the day. And anyone who's ambitious enough to want to be vice president is probably ambitious enough to have the apparatus to try to get it done. That's always the name of the game. But I do think I've heard both sides of this, right? The Biden campaign and the aides that I've spoken to say it was important for him to lay down the metric at that point in March when he was effectively the nominee. Bernie Sanders was still in, but Biden was trying to show what kind of administration he would build. They felt it was an important metric to lay out. Some in his orbit said something along the lines of, it was empowering to say, men, it's not your time, you can sit down. But then the other side of it is, there's a lot of people who wished that he would have just said, this is the field of people who I happen to be considering. And oh gosh, are they all really women? Well, I'm just going to pick the best one, as opposed to picking the best woman, which they still argue that they did. But I would also say that in Biden choosing Kamala at that point, and in the book, I try to dip back into history. So 1984, when Mondale chooses Geraldine Ferraro, the first time you have a female VP. And then again in 2008 with John McCain choosing Sarah Palin, stunning most of the political world when he did it. In both of those situations, you had male candidates at the top of the ticket who were struggling politically. In the polls, they were down, they were lacking energy around their candidacies. I view Palin and Ferraro as sort of throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks and what excites the party choices. With Biden, the fact that when he picked Harris and when he laid out the metric that he was going to choose a woman is a sign of progress, because he was saying in that moment, not only was it politically advantageous to have a diverse ticket with a woman running alongside him, but also at the apex of his power, he was acknowledging it was powerful to bring that lived experience and diversity on with him. And that's a big departure from the last few times that we've seen women as running mates.
Absolutely. So we've talked about Kamala Harris. We've talked a little bit about Kirsten Gillibrand. I want to just have you share your thoughts, because you spoke to them, both Elizabeth Warren, of course, like, to me, the enduring memory of the campaign with her was the pinky promises and the selfie lines, right? And what that meant. And then also, Amy Klobuchar, who again was also considered as one of the vice presidential picks as well.
Yeah, both Warren and Klobuchar end up in that Veep stakes. Warren going much further than Klobuchar was able to. But look, for Klobuchar, I think she's a fascinating case study in someone who politically was probably aligned with the moment, being a moderate from the Midwest, but at the same time was regularly tasked. Her central theme was electability, bringing the receipts. She loved to talk about all the things that she had accomplished, and many of them in bipartisan fashion. But it seemed like there was not enough to judge her potential, even though she had so much that she had already done. And with Klobuchar, she was aware of the fact she's so politically adept that the barometer and the environment she was operating in among Democrats, it was that they were so skittish, and that she was aware that even if she wasn't trying to campaign overtly on gender, that it was still something that was functioning against her. She would still be asked, can a woman win? And it would knock her off her theme of talking about her own electability, because she had won multiple times in a purplish state. And the same went for Elizabeth Warren. Certainly Massachusetts not purple in that conventional way as Minnesota, but winning in marquee races, beating Scott Brown to get to the Senate in one of the hottest contests of that election cycle. She had proven herself to be electable too. And I think when Warren looks back on her presidential run, there are political reasons why I think she didn't get the nomination. And I spent the most time with her and her campaign. I think on healthcare, for example, they just waited too long to come out with the plan, when really the entire primary, every debate, we would like painstakingly spend so much time talking about Medicare for all versus any other kind of healthcare plan. They just waited a little bit too long, and their rivals pounced on them for that, even as she was the candidate with a plan for that. But the moment that sticks with me, and frankly, the moment that really launched this book, frankly, on the day that she dropped out, she talked about the fact that she was thankful for the voters who expanded in their minds just a little bit what they thought a president could look like. And she knew that gender was a barrier. And it's something that she talked about with us off the record in details that I've since reported for the first time in this book. But also throughout, it was clear that she was always thinking about gender, closing her message in Iowa by saying simply that women win. Again, trying to speak to electability and how women had done so well electorally in the age of Trump. What it all comes down to is all these women were asked any number of ways to talk about how they could win, how they could be electable. And even when they showed that they did it better than the men who were running, they still weren't able to sufficiently answer that question in the mind of the electorate.
Yeah. And so as we think about 2024, what in sort of this invisible primary that goes on. And of course, the biggest parlor game in Washington now is, does Biden run? Does he not run? Right. But in your opinion, what does the field look like if Biden doesn't run? Do we have Kamala Harris? Does Elizabeth Warren get back in? Does Amy Klobuchar get back in? What are your thoughts on the Democratic side? And then, the Republican side as well, with some female governors, could potentially run as well. And of course, there's the Trump factor hanging out there. Does he run? Does he not run? What are your thoughts kind of heading into 2024?
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality in the way we do politics, right, is that if you're the incumbent or if you're the guy who was just in the White House and you want to run again, you've got the best claim to it. We've only seen men get to do that, but I would say gender aside, because frankly, that is the way that this goes. But if Biden doesn't run, certainly the first person you have to consider is the vice president of the United States. And many of the people who I talked to for this book, despite the fact that she has had a very rocky go of it as vice president, many of them still think that she's better positioned than anyone else if, and these are the caveats that would govern any vice president's future presidential aspirations, if Biden is in good standing, depending on what his legacy looks like, depending on what his favorability ratings are. All of that is really going to matter, because ultimately Biden's legacy is what Harris ends up running on if and when she runs in 2024 or after. But there are other people, even within the cabinet, who we could be seeing who are women. I think Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo is someone who comes to mind, having been a governor and now serving in the cabinet. But then also Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, someone who was part of the Veep stakes, who has been leading the charge on reproductive access, someone that Democrats are paying a lot of attention to, and arguably has a great case to make president-wise, win or lose in 2020. She's got one of the marquee contests, obviously, this cycle. But certainly she's got a long future ahead, regardless of if she wins or loses in 2022 rather. And then of course you could see people like Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar try to run again. And I think it's a sign again of how Democrats have built out that bench. And there could be newcomers on top of that. And then look, on the Republican side too, 2020 was a year where many operatives who had sort of been sounding the alarm to the predominantly male Republican apparatus and leadership that they needed to do better at investing in female candidates. Elise Stefanik is someone who has done that through her super PAC, but there are other PACs who are trying to do the same thing, with the caveat that there is this fascinating dynamic happening in Republican politics right now, that these hyper-conservative, very pro-Trump women like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene have a lot of power within the party because of their command of the grassroots, frankly. But they are sort of deemed among Republican operatives who I talk to as, not just because you're a woman doesn't mean that you're a good leader. In fact, you represent a part of our party that we don't want to see. And so Republicans have felt the need to say, well, we'll only help support viable or qualified women. So certainly there is a dynamic at play here in Republican politics about, okay, it's not just about bringing up women, it's about bringing up a certain kind of conservative woman. But certainly when you think about conservatives who could run for president, Liz Cheney is the first person that comes to mind. She's clearly toying with this. But then also people like Governor Kristi Noem in South Dakota. I think that Carrie Lake is someone who, whether or not she runs for president, she'll certainly be on the national stage in 2024, especially if she wins the Arizona governor's race. Elise Stefanik is someone who I'm watching, maybe not for president, but certainly for what she does in Congress as she's in leadership there. So, and Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador who served with Trump and governor of South Carolina 2 terms. I mean, she's someone who's got a long runway ahead of her as well, and just released a book, which is usually one of the tea leaf readings that we like to see for the shadow primary.
Exactly. Well, you write about, when thinking about Republicans, you write about this notion that we've heard a lot about Republicans not wanting to focus on gender when it comes to, women in politics and running. And you spoke to Congresswoman Nancy Mace, of course, the Republican Congresswoman from South Carolina, first female graduate of the Citadel. And that was very much her thinking too, is, we don't as Republicans focus on our gender, right? And so that comes into play. But yet we saw Republicans, I think, after only electing one new woman to Congress in 2018, sort of, as you mentioned, kind of double down and start investing in women in 2020 with much success. And many of the seats that they were able to flip were because they put competitive, good, qualified women on the ballot there, and they ended up winning. And so that was something that Republican operatives were saying to me, that there was now proof of return on investment for running and supporting women. And I think it's a good time for us to point out, like, part of the reason that I spend so much time focusing on primaries in the book is, yes, because you had a diverse primary field for president in 2020, but also once you get to the general election, especially for presidentials, but broadly speaking, people are pretty tribal. If you're the Republican, you get the Republicans. If you're the Democrat, you get the Democrats. It's in primaries that the isms, racism, genderism, sexism, those are where they tend to manifest, and where the structural inequities of the system are just harder for women, whether it's on fundraising or attracting the right kind of staff. All of those barriers exist, and they are the most heavily at play in primaries. But yeah, the thing with the Republicans that I found, I talked to people who worked for Michelle Bachmann, who of course ran for president, Carly Fiorina herself, who was the only woman in the 2016 field. I think Fiorina is really indicative of the mindset here, which is that she'll cop to the fact it's different when you're different, is what she said to me, but then would very quickly pivot to the idea that it should all be about merit, which of course it should be. But it's hard to only focus on the merit when the road that you're running on is just completely uneven, and everyone else you're running against
has a completely straight path ahead of them. And so you have to address that there are inequities there. And part of what I hope to do with the book is make people so aware of the biases and narratives that can come about around female candidates that the narratives are easier to disrupt, because once you see it, it's kind of hard to stop seeing it. And that should just make the path more level.
Exactly. We have a couple questions here, so let me try to run through a few of them with you. Just on the topic we were talking about, Sydney has a question. She says, do you think there are different qualifications for being electable for Republican women versus Democratic women?
I think that's really fascinating. One of the things I think that comes about is the idea that once you're deemed electable, and I would argue that, and studies that I found for this book and that I include in the book show that if there's a demographic concern on the part of a conservative voter, it can be assuaged by proving your ideological stripes. So if you're a woman and you want to prove that you are conservative enough, it's why we've seen so many women candidates on the right be so hyper conservative around so-called women's issues, around the idea, for example, of abortion. The same thing goes along racial lines too, making sure that if you are a candidate of color on the right, trying to speak against ideas like affirmative action and the culture wars that we see the right often waging along the lines of race and gender, those are ways that you can establish conservative credentials, even if an audience may subconsciously or consciously come with the bias that a woman might not be conservative enough or a person of color might not be conservative enough. That's at least what one study I found in the book showed. And so that's one way of establishing those qualifications. But again, for all candidates, this is true. And a bunch of the research that you guys do and others have pointed out, women especially need validators. That's true whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. You need people to speak on your behalf to show what kind of leader you are. And that's going to be key for anybody who's running.
For sure. Let's see. We also have a question about lessons that future female presidential candidates should take away from 2020.
This is really fascinating, I think. One of the things that always stuck with me when I talked with Secretary Hillary Clinton, she was talking to almost every single woman who ran during 2020 throughout the arc of the primary. And I asked her if they had anything in common when they would talk about what they were experiencing in the race. And what she said is they had all run in high profile, high stakes states, big Senate races. They'd all had pretty big careers, if not on the national stage for a presidency, but they were well known. And all of them in some way or another expressed how much more the misogyny felt palpable at the presidential level, how those narratives were quicker to take hold. They were almost surprised by that. But Clinton, of course, in her response said something to the effect of, but I'd been there, so I knew exactly what they were going through. As you get more into that spotlight, that's one of the things that's worth expecting. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't campaign authentically. And it's why one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, yes, the candidates have to strategize, knowing all of the things that this book points out. The fact that debate stages that are wins can also somehow be counted as losses, or when you're laughing, sometimes people will somehow find that that's an inauthentic laugh. I mean, we don't allow necessarily women to show the same complexities, the same different range of emotion, of anger, of sadness. All of that is still baked in the cake, unfortunately. But I also think that on the other side of it, taking the power out of the candidates' hands and looking at us as the media, I do think that having more diverse newsrooms where the reporter's lived experience is closer to that of the candidates, so that they can better explain to people why, for example, it's important to the way that Kamala Harris sees leadership and community, that she would go to celebrate her sorority and go to celebrations of the Divine Nine. Having reporters who actually know what the Divine Nine is, those are all important pieces to being able to explain candidates that don't all just look white and male like most of the candidates that we have seen throughout history.
Very true. Here's a question from Megan. She says, what message will it send when a woman is finally elected to the presidency?
Heck yeah, we did it. No, truthfully, look, I think the message that it sends is reflective governance is a good thing in that it brings about policy that touches more people, ideally in a positive way. Having more people at the table who can understand the impact of a policy through multiple lenses, economically, racially, demographically, lived experience-wise, that means that government's functioning better for people. And Liz Cheney made a joke a few weeks ago that always sticks with me. She said, men have been running things for a while and it hasn't been going so well. There's a lot of reasons that Liz Cheney would say that, and it's hilarious on its face. But it's also something that speaks to a country that has never tried, outside of Barack Obama being the first Black male president, they've never tried any other model of leadership. And it would serve this country well to be represented by as many different kinds of people that live in this country as possible. And so this is a barrier that would make people feel seen when we break it, yes, but that also could have really big impacts on the way that this country governs and how people are touched by government.
And you write in the book about Hillary Clinton actually thinking that it could very well be a Republican woman who makes it to the White House first. Why is that?
Which I think surprised some people when they read it, but it's because she's a student of history, and she's not the only person who said this to me. Democrats and Republicans alike are aware of the fact that when you look, for example, at places like Great Britain and across other countries, when they've had their first women, those women have broadly come from the conservative side of the spectrum first. Now, what you think about when you think about Great Britain too is the fact that systemically, they just do their elections differently. And this is also true in places like Germany and New Zealand and others where we've seen female heads of state come up as prime minister or chancellor. When you're elected within a parliamentary body and then elevated out of that, that's a very different kind of executive role than just being an outright executive. If that's how we did things in the US, we'd have President Nancy Pelosi and I wouldn't have needed to write this book. But that's not the way that we do things here. So there is a systemic argument to be made there when you look at other countries. But yeah, history has shown that conservative women can get there first. Though Clinton was very fast to say to me, she thought that it could happen. She really hopes that's not the way that it shakes out, unsurprisingly.
Right. Obviously. Let's see. Here's another question about comparing 2020 to 2016. The questioner wants to know, is 2020 a more predictive election than 2016 in terms of how women will fare in the future as presidential candidates?
Gosh, I think 2016 and 2020 both have such irreplicable factors as part of them. Yeah. I mean, in 2020, it was pretty jarring to me to see that the lesson that people took away from 2016 wasn't that America was majority-wise ready to elect a female executive. Instead, the takeaway that I found very vexing seemed to be that one woman lost to one man once, and so the whole endeavor needed to be called into question, despite the fact that Trump himself had beaten 16 or 17 men on his path to the nomination as well. And none of those men were ever posed, well, do you think that a man could ever beat Trump? That was never going to be the deduction. But because one woman lost once, there was seemingly a cloud over this entire endeavor. And so I think Trump is a really irreplicable factor in 2020. I don't know if he can be predictive, but I do think the thing that I found instructive is this idea that in 2020, electability, and there were multiple studies about this that I point to, is because electability seemed like such a shaky metric for the women, people were actively changing their votes because they had questions about whether or not these women could win. And so it wasn't just a metric that you needed to clear in theory, it was one that was actually impacting electoral bottom lines. And the bright spot is that when Stanford did that study about the 2020 field using specific names of candidates, Warren and Harris, I think, were who they polled, they found that if you disrupted those narratives around women not being electable or framing them from a negative, if you just said, if you vote for the person that you like, they can win, then people change their votes less. And that's instructive for whoever comes next.
Well, and you also write about this notion of kind of normalizing success, and Julie Conway, PAC, a Republican PAC that elects, helps to elect women, Republican women in primaries. She said, it has to stop being kind of the year of the woman or the year of the Democratic woman, year of Republican woman. It just has to evolve to, like, we've picked up 5 seats this cycle, we've picked up 7 seats this cycle, and same goes in many ways for like being the first for something. Like, is there a way we just normalize this?
Eventually it is a numbers game, which I think is a good thing, because at this point you look at both parties and they both have pipelines full of really good potential candidates. We just listed off just a few on each side, but it's a testament to the fact that both parties have begun to invest in filling their ranks with good women who can build long careers in politics and have solid resumes to eventually run for president on if they so choose. And so I think that at a certain point, it is a numbers game, but I also think that 2020 normalized a whole bunch of different ways to run for president while female. A lot of the women in the field were tagged with the baggage of Hillary Clinton, and many of them at various points were just compared to her in a knee-jerk way because they all happened to be women who ran for the same office. But now at least there are more touchstones. If you are a moderate woman running, you are probably going to be compared to Amy Klobuchar. If you are a progressive, you'll probably be compared to Elizabeth Warren. You know, there's a number of different people now who you can be compared to. You don't just have to be, oh, well, you're a blonde woman and Hillary was a blonde woman, so everyone's just like the ghost of Hillary, right? I mean, and that's a progress point in and of itself, just being able to expand Americans' idea of what it can look like, but also having it normalized that you are actively looking at your ballot and considering female candidates at the top of your ticket potentially. And that's something too. Normalizing this practice is really important.
Exactly. We have a question from Julie who asks about ranked choice voting and whether you think it would yield more women in elected office.
It's a great question. And actually, I was in Alaska for the special election for the House that Mary Peltola ended up winning. Sarah Palin was also on the ballot there. And then, of course, Lisa Murkowski is on the ballot there. And that's a Senate contest that we're watching very closely. But experts that I was talking to about ranked choice voting say that it is a system that can benefit women because of the qualities that are generally stereotypically assigned to female candidates, which is that they can build consensus. And the whole goal in a ranked choice voting system is to be, you know, at least palatable to your opponent's supporters so that if I rank Betsy first, at least people don't hate me so much that they won't rank me second. And so if Betsy doesn't reach the threshold, I can then pick up a lot of her voters. And Palin, although she's a woman, has always campaigned as a firebrand. And so politically, ideologically, she doesn't necessarily work in a system like ranked choice voting, but someone like Mary Peltola, who won there, but campaigned so congenially to the point where Republicans would whisper to us, she's just so nice. It really worked for her in being able to not just coalesce the Democrats there, but also pick up some Republicans as well.
Right, because they're not as polarizing as somebody like Sarah Palin would be, you know, love her or hate her in many ways, right?
Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, experts say that this is one system that tends to benefit or could benefit women candidates.
Okay, so as we wrap up here, we have a final question also from Julie about your sweater. And she wants to know, is it a custom design or can other people buy this cool sweater places?
This was a gift from a friend of mine. I'm pretty sure she ordered it custom somewhere, but I think there have to be electable sweaters on the internet. Yeah. I mean, that has to be a thing. And if not, I think I just found what I'm doing with my Wednesday night.
Yeah, we're always looking for good swag around here. So
we need some merch. Let's get some good merch.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Ali, thank you so much for this discussion and for this book, which I just think is a great contribution to studying women in politics, and congratulations on that. We appreciate you spending some time talking with us about it tonight. I'm going to let everybody know too, in 2 weeks on the 26th, we're going to have Dr. Bonnie Morris here. She's actually an AU alum. She's going to discuss her new book, What's the Score? 25 Years of Teaching Women's Sports History, which will be interesting in context of the 50th anniversary of Title IX, of course. And then the day after the midterms, on the 9th, we are going to convene a special panel with Amanda Hunter from the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, who partners with us on a lot of things, and who Ali mentions their research in the book, and Christine Matthews, a pollster, Atim Arera, a strategist, and we're going to break down the midterm elections and talk about who won, women candidates, how they fared, and of course, you know, women voters as well. So we hope you all will join us for those two discussions to round out the semester. But thank you for everyone for being with us tonight. And again, Ali, thank you so much for joining us. with us.
So appreciate it. Thanks, Betsy.
Okay. Take care.